they all died, but they found the wrecks of the ships in just this last couple of years. Well, that's the danger of the North. And in this illustration, you can see the cartographers, again, the fantasy of, well, what is there up there? In this case, they thought if it wasn't for the ice, there was probably a land bridge between Europe and North America, which, of course, turned out not to be true. But I particularly like the angry wind gods that they put into this particular view of the world. But then the French kept coming, and after Cartier had gone right around where we are, he landed first right at Gaspé, the town we were. If anybody got on the tour to go see, there was a marker where it was Cartier who claimed it for the King of France, quickly followed by many other settlers and then military. And this man, Samuel de Champlain, was the military commander who came with ships and troops to and colonists to really settle New France. There's no portrait better than this of them. He was a rather gruff fellow, but a great leader, and he crossed the Atlantic 25 times, ferrying over more and more French to settle the great St. Lawrence, and also to defend it against their not-so-friendly natives. And the history of Canada is often playing off one native group against the other, in this case the Huron versus the Iroquois, and then the French and English, and all of the 7 years and the French and Indian Wars terrorized the whole continent because the alliances would shift and there'd be battles up and down all the rivers in the new settlements. Well, of course, the key element that made it successful for the French and English is they had firearms, and so how many natives were blown away, and the armor protected the European incursions. Well, Champlain is the most famous of the explorers of interior Canada, and he founded the city of Quebec, 1608. His statue is almost everywhere. The Great Lake Champlain is named after him. But he was never the governor. He was the military commander, and he kept going farther, deeper into the river systems. And then he produced this kind of a chart, which details a lot of the people and the villages and the places to go for ongoing exploration and settlement. Now, this is his own cartography at the Baie de Chaleur, where we just left yesterday, and that is Anacostia Island, and the Gaspé, and now we're up on the north side of Gaspé Peninsula, and coming up into Saguenay. Now, this is again Champlain's cartographer detailed the shallows and the rocks. That one has an H on it, where they have that tremendous big navigation buoy standing that we just passed on our way into the fjord. So again, you can imagine what it was like being the first European to come up and look at this tremendous land. It sort of goes on forever, and there's always more rivers and more mountains, and also more people. But Champlain was first to get to the Great Lakes. First of all, past Montreal into Lake Ontario, Lake Erie, and then Lake Huron, and Lake Michigan, and finally Lake Superior. So this was a whole new world, and mostly reached by canoe, because you could not get an ocean ship up over the rapids above Montreal. And so the French colonization started let's say right there in Gaspé where we were, but Champlain himself chose Quebec to be the stronghold, because it's where, as I described, the river narrows, there's a promontory, they built the first fortress there, and then the bigger city will be there tomorrow to see that it is kind of a grand site on the river. And it became the commercial center for New France until Montreal assumed a larger role because of its closer position to all of the interior lakes and the trade that was coming down, particularly the fur trade. So this is what Quebec looked like back when Champlain first set it up, and he spent his whole life dedicated to this. Even though he went back and forth to France, he finally died peacefully in Quebec, and they built a chapel for him. But then in those days, most buildings were wooden, and at one point the whole neighborhood burnt down, and his remains were finally lost. But he's still the hero of New France to this day. Well, then the British came in, and then this again is a chart of the Admiralty that was drawn by the young officer James Cook. And I described before the attack on Quebec depended upon the very precise cartography that Cook provided as they came in. Now this was the day where the aristocrats would come over. They'd be given land and then tenancy. The church got about 30% of the land. This is one of the nobles that came from France, Marquis de Boishebert, who was given the island of Saint-Jean, which is now Prince Edward Island. And of course, when the British came in to force the French out in that strategic quality, they had to go to places they perhaps didn't know that well until they got there. So this is, again, the siege of Louisbourg. And I'll show you, I found a few more photos of what it looks like today, because it's a tremendous fortress and is restored as a national park. But this was the toehold that was, rather the fortress that was going to keep the British away. And of course, when it fell, that led to the transference of Quebec to become a colony of the British Empire. So those days are sort of fondly remembered by the French Canadians as sort of a glorious time before they were humiliated by the defeat in Quebec City in 1759. But what it led to was this expulsion. Now this is not really exploration, but this is very much the heart of Canadian history is this conflict. So these are the Acadians being driven out by British troops, and famously the poem of Longfellow, Evangeline, describes the sorrow of the French being driven off their lands, and then the ensuing conflicts with the various Indians. This is in Halifax, the monument to the Acadians who were taken out of their homes right there in Nova Scotia and Halifax and sent to Louisiana. Many went back to France, and what they call in French, le grand dérangement. And so this is still a bitter memory here. But what also did is meant that more of the French went west. So they would pick up and they'd take their what they could, and they would make more settlements all the way out into the great rivers. And so Canada became a story of exploring by river and coming into lakes and then meeting and making peace with the natives. Here's a statue of Champlain himself with his native guide going up into further chart and to finally settle all of these vast interior. And of course, a lot of the natives, let's say, did not have a good ending. These are the Beothuk people of Newfoundland who were finally exterminated, and there are no more of them left, whereas there's over 200 other native groups in Canada which have managed to survive. But you can see in this lovely painting the greeting that were given the Champlain and the French as they came in with their what must have seemed like a tremendous cruise ship back to that time. And of course, the food was merely French aboard, but this is sort of a romantic period where the natives would be welcoming, and the French went out of their way to try to make peace with the different groups, because they knew that without that help they probably could not survive and then continue farther and establish their settlements. Well, I described earlier how the Micmac people in Nova Scotia invented hockey. Well, the Algonquin people, their game was lacrosse with a stick with a bit of a net in it, and they'd throw the ball around. And this was used as a surrogate to war. If they had disputes over territory or some agreement, they would have a very large field, and they would play with hundreds of men going around hitting themselves over the head with a stick, but nobody would get killed. Maybe they get hurt, but that was a curious native tradition here, that they would not go at each other in warfare, but merely in sports, which of course is a great Canadian tradition. And then their descriptions of particularly the Algonquin people, had great convocations where they would take all of the dead and bury them in common graves and have a ceremony around them. And well, the history of the natives is complex, because there's so many different groups, often at odds with each other. And then as the French and then the English kept coming up the rivers and making settlements and inducing the fur trade, giving them weapons, iron, and other benefits of contact. They also got more disease, more trouble, and so there was conflict all over Canada for a couple of hundred years. And the same thing happened south in the Americas. Scalping became a tradition that was actually introduced by the Dutch in the Hudson Valley as a count during the initial colonial battles in that area, but it became a gruesome tradition throughout all of the Americas. And the conflicts also meant that there were many martyrs, particularly the missionaries. It was often the French priests that were the ones at the front of this exploration by canoe into the larger continent, and many of them became victims and martyrs for the cause. So they're remembered, and now most of the Native Americans are in one form or the other. Christian is shown here by the native version of the Virgin Mary and Jesus. So religion sort of caused but also pacified a lot of this conflict. And to this day, the religious faith is still pretty deep all through Canada, but in the natives. And then the continuing history of exploration in Canada was done by what they call the Voyagers, who were often a mixed, what they call the Métis, which is the mixed breed French with different native people, and then they would be the ones that would go out in the winter on snowshoes or in canoes in the summer and go hunting and bring back particularly beaver pelts were the great trade item at the time. And so rather than have one or two great heroes like Champlain, the rest of the exploration and discovery of Canada, at least in the eastern part of the continent, was done by these voyageurs in their canoes and then with their traders. And so that the canoe would take people to cross the lakes, down the rivers to Detroit, Chicago, down the Mississippi, up the rivers into Saskatchewan, Manitoba, and then of course the continuing exploration went all the way Mackenzie, up the Mackenzie River in this vast continent. It was done by canoe. So these are illustrations of the explorers that came to all these places that are now just small towns on the map, but they were originally wilderness territory where only the brave would go and depended upon the natives to take them there and to trade and discuss things and continue the discovery of Canada. Well, in my looking into this, I came upon an old Quebec story about the Flying Canoe, which was a fantasy story about the voyageurs who built a certain kind of canoe that could fly. Now, this is a Canadian or Quebec version of the Arabian 101 Nights and the Flying Carpet. It's very much like this because they'd say an incantation, they'd say a prayer, and then the canoe would just fly over all this territory and land somewhere else. Now, this should be the symbol for Air Canada now, and we take this kind of for granted. We just go down the road and suddenly we fly over somewhere and we just land and there we are. I mean, now it's so mundane, if not painful. But this is a vision of how to get around Canada, which maybe they'll have a flying canoe someday, or a drone canoe. Maybe that's it. Anyway, I'm going to stop and just say that I'm as a sailor, I was raised on all these tales of adventure, and then I ended up being a Coast Guard licensed captain. But I also have a sail certificate, and this is a community boat that we sail right now out of Connecticut. It's actually Mystic Seaport, and this is an old English Channel sail ferry built in 1924 in Falmouth, and it worked from the Isle of Jersey back and forth on 10-hour crossings of the English Channel, something nobody did for fun. Well, as they say, anybody who goes to sea for pleasure probably should go to hell for a holiday. It's very unusual that nowadays we have a ship like this will take us all these places in comfort and interest. And so if you want to have a hard sail back to England, we're taking it back to the Isle of Jersey any week now when the weather clears up a bit. And we're donating actually to the Channel Islands Trust because it's the last vessel from that era that was part of the 1940 evacuations of British troops, not from Dunkirk, but from Saint-Malo. And so we're sending it back home as soon as we get it ready for the voyage. We may put it on another ship just to make sure we get there. But anyway, that's my volunteer effort. And then here's another ship that I work on, which is a three-masted marine biological research vessel, which is a slow vessel made for going into very shallow areas for coral research and also plankton research. It has an engine, but it usually is sort of drifting along in its Chinese-style rig, and it's currently in the shipyard in Barcelona. So I'm just going to leave you with a couple of other sayings, not necessarily pertinent to Canada, but to the rest of our human experience. So this is T.S. Eliot. Only those who go too far can know how far one can go. And even that's true in our own lives. If you have the bug to travel and see things, there's always more to learn, even in your own backyard. And here's another ancient saying from the Mediterranean, pardon my Latin accent there, but it means those who run across the sea cannot change their soul, which in these days you can get on a fast ship or particularly an airplane, suddenly you're there. But the whole point of voyaging at sea is to have time, contemplation, and when you get somewhere, you have new eyes for the world, and hopefully you have learned something or experienced something. And here's another saying from actually even going further back into Phoenician times: time spent at sea does not add to your age on land, which is a good reason to stay on a ship like this as long as you can. Anyway, with that, I'd like to thank Lorraine and all the staff and the technical crew that make this great ship operate. It's been my great pleasure to travel with you, and I look forward to you on the next sea. Thank you very much. Thank you.